What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Today's briefing is one of those days when the headlines not just tell you what happened, they tell you what kind of war this is becoming. Because over the last 24 hours, and in the latest reporting around it, we got three especially important signals at the same time. First, Ukraine appears to be turning the tide of war by launching more long-range drones attack drones than Russia did in March for the first time since the full-scale invasion began. Second, one of Russia's biggest refineries, called NORSI, completely suspended operations and went offline after a Ukrainian strike, showing that this campaign against oil infrastructure is not symbolic anymore. Third, former CIA Director David Petraeus is now openly saying Russia no longer has the upper hand, arguing that Ukraine's innovation in drones, battlefield networking, and command systems is starting to offset Moscow's traditional advantages in manpower and firepower. On top of all of that, Volodymyr Zelensky says he still stands by a limited ceasefire proposal for Easter, while Reuters is also reporting that Ukraine's own deep strike program faces a serious mini-jet engine bottleneck. And then inside Russia, the Kremlin's push towards state-backed messenger app called Max, more commonly known by you guys as surveillance app by the FSB, is raising questions about control, private information becoming public, and domestic pressure. So the thesis for today's video is quite simple. Russia is still dangerous, still attacking, still putting pressure on the front lines and in Ukrainian cities, but the structure of the war is shifting in ways that could matter way more over the next several months than any single day of map changes. Because Ukraine is increasingly trying to turn this into a war of systems, logistics, oil, engines, software, and state resilience. And if that is really what we are seeing right now, then the next biggest question is no longer just who moved forward near this village or that one, but whether Russia can sustain its pressure while Ukraine keeps finding cheaper, smarter, and deeper ways to impose costs on the Russian system. Let's talk about all of that in today's briefing. When many viewers hear that Russia is still pressing offensives, the automatic assumption is that Moscow must still hold the initiative in the old-fashioned sense. That is just a matter of time, attrition, and quality. And yes, Russia still has significant manpower, artillery, and economic depth, but the latest reporting suggests that the battlefield is becoming much less comfortable for that assumption. For example, the most recent, the Institute for the Study of War April 6 assessment, highlighted that Ukraine's expanding long-range strike campaign against Russian oil infrastructure is exploiting overstretched Russian air defenses and damaging Russian oil export capabilities, while also noting continued criticism from Russian military bloggers about the ineffectiveness of Russian air defenses and wider manpower problems as Russia struggles to recruit enough contract soldiers to replace frontline losses. All that matters, because it tells you that this war is no longer just about tactical pressure and the contact line, but about whether Russia can keep its military machine fed, protected, and staffed, while Ukraine keeps finding vulnerable points behind it. Now here is where it gets interesting. David Petraeus, speaking to CBC about after another trip to Ukraine, said that Russia no longer has the upper hand, and that over the last 2 months, Ukrainians have made greater incremental gains than the Russians. He tied that specific judgment directly to Ukraine's unmanned systems, its command and control integration, and the Delta battlefield management platform, which he described as something like pretty much a military version of Google Maps. Petraeus argued that Ukraine's advantage is not just the existence of drones, but the ecosystem around them, the way surveillance, targeting, mapping, and strike capabilities are all pulled together into that one system, which in his telling now gives Ukrainian forces nearly absolute surveillance and strike capacity within roughly 20 miles of the front line. And that is exactly why the war can look the other one way on a static map, and very different when you examine how the system actually functions. Russia may still have larger stockpiles, more troops, and more room to absorb pain, but if every movement near the front is increasingly exposed to surveillance, if every logistics node deeper inside Russia becomes more vulnerable to long-range drone pressure, and if every attempt to grind forward brings less strategic payoff than before, that this so-called upper hand starts becoming a much more complicated phrase than it looked like just a 6 months ago. Petraeus even went further, saying that one Ukrainian manufacturer told him it plans to make 3 million drones this year alone, compared with roughly 300,000 produced by the United States last year. So before we move to the oil story, remember this: the map still matters, but the system behind the map may matter even more now. And that is exactly why the next chapter is so important. And also, if you guys want to do a one-time support for our work, you can do so through PayPal donations. All of them are greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. The link is down below. Now let's continue. This is what changed everything, or at least what may become one of the biggest turning points in how we describe this war. Because according to reporting by United24, summarizing an ABC News analysis of daily data released by the Ukrainian Air Force and the Russian Ministry of Defense, March was the first month since the full-scale invasion began in 2022 in which Ukraine launched more attack drones than Russia. There are some repairs happening in the building, guys, so sorry about it. According to the Russian Defense Ministry's own figures, Russia claimed to have downed 7,347 Ukrainian drones in March, averaging about 237 per day, while the Ukrainian Air Force reported defending against 6,462 Russian drones and 138 missiles, averaging about 208 drones and 4 missiles per day. Of course, neither side's wartime data can be treated like just a perfect spreadsheet, and ABC said it could not independently verify the figures, but even with that caution, the trend itself is the story. Because for the most of the war, Russia was assumed to hold a long-range strike volume advantage. Now imagine what this means psychologically, politically, and operationally. For a long time, Russia wanted the war to feel one-directional in the air, with Iranian-designed Shahed drones and missile salvos creating the sense that Ukraine was constantly reacting and constantly defending. But if Ukraine is now reaching the point where it can generate equal or even greater volumes of long-range unmanned pressure, then the war becomes much more complicated, much more expensive for Russia at home, and much more awkward for the Kremlin's internal narrative. It is one thing to tell Russian people that military operations are far away and are under control. It is completely another thing when industrial infrastructure, refineries and other critical sites inside Russia start becoming part of the public conversation on a regular basis. And then Petraeus' comments fit into this picture almost perfectly, because he said that the real genius is how Ukraine is pulling all of this together. Not just drones as isolated gadgets, but drones tied into surveillance, software, command and strike chains. He also said what is coming next may be algorithmically piloted drones that are harder to jam, reducing reliance on GPS and allowing operators to control more than just one system at a time. If he's eventually even partially right, then what we are watching is not just an increase in numbers, but the early shape of the next phase of the war, where adaptation speed may matter way more than traditional mass in some sectors. But here is the catch. A rising drone count is not automatically the same thing as strategic dominance, because volume without targeting, sustainability and industrial support can become very expensive fireworks instead of lasting advantage. And that brings us straight to the next chapter, where the numbers stop being abstract and start turning into refinery shutdowns, oil pressure and hard economic consequences for Russia's war machine. Let's talk about it right now. Now, if that does not surprise you, this will. Long word. Nizhegorodnefteorgsintez, known as NORSI, which Reuters and Ukrainskaya Pravda described as Russia's fourth largest oil refinery and its second largest gasoline producer, completely suspended operations on April 5th after a Ukrainian drone attack. The plant is owned by Lukoil, sits around 450 kilometers east of Moscow and roughly 800 kilometers away from Ukraine, and has a processing capacity of 16 million metric tons of oil per year, or about 320,000 barrels per day. Governor Gleb Nikitin said 2 facilities at the plant were hit, along with a power station and several buildings, and according to Reuters industry sources cited by Ukrainskaya Pravda, supplies could be suspended until the end of April. Even more telling, Lukoil reportedly stopped offering gasoline, diesel fuel or fuel oil for sale from the refinery on the St. Petersburg International Mercantile Exchange. That is not just a symbolic headline, that is operational disruption. When viewers hear drone attack on the refinery, some treat it just like another dramatic incident, but the strategic point is much bigger than the individual facility. Russia's war depends on oil revenue, refining capacity, fuel logistics, export credibility, and the perception that the economic core of the system remains resilient despite sanctions and battlefield strain. So when Ukrainian strikes start reaching deeper, hitting facilities tied to exports and domestic fuel production, and forcing suspensions that can last weeks or even months, the whole issue stops being about spectacle and starts becoming a test of how much defensive coverage Russia can provide across a gigantic territory. Institute for the Study of War's latest take lines up with that, arguing that Ukraine's long-range campaign is exploiting limitations in Russian air defenses and damaging oil export capabilities in meaningful ways. There is also a political angle here that should not be ignored. For the Kremlin, strategic messaging works best when hardship is either hidden, localized, or easily blamed on the West in some vague way. But repeated successful strikes on critical infrastructure create a different problem, because they suggest that Russia's own defensive state is less competent than advertised. Russian military bloggers criticizing air defense performance are not just complaining about tactics. They are widening cracks in the broader narrative of control. How can a supposedly stable, they say, wartime state promise security everywhere if refineries, ports, and critical nodes remain so vulnerable and targeted literally almost every single day? At this point, you might be wondering why this matters so much beyond economics. And the answer is that oil pressure does not replace battlefield fighting, but it changes the cost structure around it. If Russia has to spend more resources protecting infrastructure, dispersing assets, repairing facilities, compensating for supply interruptions, and calming domestic unease, then those are resources and attention not being spent elsewhere. And just when this campaign is showing results, Zelensky is still publicly holding open the idea of a limited ceasefire around Orthodox Easter, which creates a very interesting contrast between Ukrainian leverage and Russian diplomatic posture. And that is where the next part of the story becomes even more revealing. Here is the part that really matters. Zelensky said he still stands by a ceasefire proposal to Russia, including conditions around Orthodox Easter and restrictions on attacks under similar terms. But Reuters reported that after new Russian attacks, including an overnight strike on Odessa, in which unfortunately 3 people died, Zelensky said Russia appeared unwilling to agree even to that narrow pause. He said, "We have repeatedly proposed to Russia a ceasefire at least for Easter, a special time of the year," and then added, "But for them, all times are the same. Nothing is sacred." Reuters also reported that Moscow reacted coolly and said it favored an overall peace deal instead. Now here is where most people go wrong. They look at stories like this and assume they are just PR stunts, just one side trying to look reasonable for Western audiences while the other side rejects it. And I mean, yes, public positioning is a part of diplomacy, but in this case, the deeper point is strategic. Ukraine is trying to show that even while it increases pressure on Russian infrastructure and builds more long-range strike capacity, it is still willing to discuss limited, practical restraint under specific conditions. Russia, meanwhile, seems to prefer talking in larger, vaguer terms about an overall peace settlement rather than accepting smaller, verifiable steps that might constrain its freedom of action. That difference matters because it tells outside players, including Washington and European capitals, something about who sees limited de-escalation as useful and who sees it as costly. There is also another layer here too. If Ukraine feels more confident in its strike capabilities, more effective in targeting Russian energy infrastructure, and more integrated in the drone domain than before, then offering a limited ceasefire does not necessarily mean weakness. It can also mean confidence. It can mean we are demonstrating that we are growing leverage, and we are also demonstrating that we are not the side refusing bounded restraint anymore. That combination is politically powerful especially if Western governments are looking for signals about seriousness and real negotiating intentions. So even though the ceasefire offer may not lead to a real pause, it still shapes the informational battlefield. But there's still one more piece to this story, because the moment you start thinking Ukraine's long-range pressure can simply keep scaling upward forever, Reuters drops a very important reminder that modern warfare is never just about courage and clever tactics. It is also about supply chains, manufacturing limits, and that one tiny industrial bottleneck capable of slowing down the whole machine. So let's talk about it in more details in the next chapter. Here's what mainstream media and many geopolitics commentators do not talk about. Ukraine's attack drones fleet faces a mini jet engine supply crunch, and Reuters described it as a looming shortage severe enough to threaten a critical stage of the war. According to Reuters, specialist mini jet engine makers across Europe are ramping up production and investment to avoid a shortage that could hold back Ukraine's rapid deep strike drone program. Fabian Hoffman of the Norwegian Defense University College said that Europe has a massive bottleneck, quote-unquote, in mini-jet engine production, while a Ukrainian defense industry source said that the shortage is, quote-unquote, probably the main factor limiting the number of missile drones produced, and called it a very big problem for Ukraine's missile program. Reuters also reported that PBC has signed an agreement to develop a new engine through a joint venture with Ukraine's Ivchenko Progress, and that PBS turbojet engines power deep strike drones such as Polyanitsa, which can reach speeds of up to 900 km per hour, compared with around 185 km per hour for the propeller-driven Shahed drones that Russia uses. Military experts cited by Reuters also note that these systems cost far less than Western cruise missiles that can carry price tags above $1 million per unit. So the Ukrainian logic here is extremely clear. If you can build relatively cheaper, faster, domestically integrated strike systems in larger numbers, you create a method of imposing strategic costs that is far more sustainable than waiting for expensive Western missiles forever. The problem is that this depends on actual engines being available in actual quantities at actual speed. And here is where the story becomes bigger than just Ukraine alone. Reuters framed the issue as a European industrial problem too, not just a Ukrainian one, because mini-jet engines matter not only for long-range drones, but also for loitering munitions and missile interceptors. In other words, this is one of those sectors where Europe is discovering in real time that strategic autonomy sounds great in speeches, but requires factories, tooling, skilled labor, investment, and urgency. If Europe wants to rely less on the United States, help Ukraine sustain pressure, and prepare for a future where unmanned systems dominate much more of the battlefield, then this bottleneck is not some obscure technical inconvenience. It is a flashing red warning sign. So, what does this all really mean? It means Ukraine's recent drone success is real, but it is not self-sustaining by magic. It means that the next stage of the war may depend less on who makes the better speech and more on who solves the harder manufacturing problem. And if you think that this is only a military question, wait until you hear what is happening inside Russia's domestic digital space, because it shows that the Kremlin understands this war is also about control at home. There is a plot twist to this that most people miss. When we talk about Russia under wartime pressure, the instinct is usually to focus on budgets, troop recruitment, or oil exports. But one of Reuters' more revealing recent stories is about the Kremlin's drive for a state-backed messenger app called Max. And this matters, because governments under long-term wartime strain do not just try to defend territory. They try to tighten control over information, dependence, and daily behavior. Reuters reported that Max is being aggressively promoted as a national messenger that is owned by VK, and that VK said on March 26 the app had already added 107 million users since launch just a year earlier. Reuters also noted that Max's boss is the son of one of Putin's top oligarchs, which is, just such a perfectly little Russian detail that it becomes almost impossible not to believe the stereotypes. But here is where it gets even more serious. Reuters spoke to Irina Matveyeva, a saxophonist in Moscow, who said that she installed Macs because she needed to communicate with her students, but also said that she tries to use it as little as possible. Reuters also said 10 other Russians expressed similar skepticism, while another Russian woman said she was effectively forced to download Macs because the state services portal called Gosuslugi, pretty much the website that handles everything from passports, driving licenses, university entrances, hunting permissions even, that this Gosuslugi demanded a confirmation number to be sent just to this app. That is not just market competition between apps. That is the state fusing convenience, bureaucracy, and digital dependence into one tool. And surveillance, almost forgot about that one. The app developed by the FSB, which is forced on people's phones, definitely gains access to all of their personal data at some point. Opposition activists cited by Reuters said Russian security services have access to Mac's data and that artificial intelligence scans the data to identify potential threats to the state and even narrow down dissent and changes to domestic opinion. Whether every technical claim can be independently confirmed or not, the political direction here is extremely clear. Russia is not merely restricting communications in wartime conditions. It is nudging, pushing, and in some cases literally forcing citizens towards a domestic platform more deeply entangled with state structures. That tells you something important about how the Kremlin sees the future. A state that feels entirely secure does not usually need to make personal messaging choices feel like administrative obligations. And this chapter actually connects back to the drone war more than it might seem at first. As Ukraine increases its ability to strike oil infrastructure, as Russian citizens feel more friction in daily life, and as the gap between official confidence and lived inconvenience becomes harder to hide, the Kremlin needs tighter narrative discipline, tighter data visibility, and tighter internal resilience. Wars of endurance are not just fought with tanks, missiles, and drones. They're also fought with apps, paperwork, public mood, and just habits of obedience. So yes, guys, if you found any of this informative, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much, see you tomorrow.